We're going to clip this on me because I have a tendency to start walking, and if we don't put this thing on the back of me, I'll walk off over there and the microphone will be torn apart. So we're going to do the microphone today. Yeah, just wherever. Okay, good. Folks, you are my first, my very first. Do you know how many firsts there are in life? There's the first kiss, the first baby, the first missionary, the first grandchild. They're all wonderful, but you are my first PowerPoint presentation. So, when Oak asked me to speak, I said, that's fine. And he said, Oak said, send me the PowerPoint presentation. And I said, I don't do PowerPoint presentations. Oak can be very kind, as you all know. He said, I think you need to do a PowerPoint presentation. So here I am. And they tell me that if I just punch this little button, I go forward. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about my passion in life. I am passionate about the Constitution of the United States because, folks, if we don't preserve that Constitution, every single thing that you have talked about today goes away. Our freedoms, thank you. Our freedoms are based on maintaining our rights, and our rights are protected by the Constitution. But before I begin, I want to tell you that there are two constitutions. I'm not really going to talk about this very much through my presentation, but you need to know it, because I'm going to be referring to the original Constitution. That's the first one. That's the real one. That's the one that's inspired. That's the one created by 55 men. Am I doing something wrong? Oh, my husband's walking up here, and I thought, oh, no, I've done something wrong. No, I thought he was coming up to tell me something. Sorry, that didn't sound right. 55 men met, poor man, in the Pennsylvania State House in 1787 to create a system of government that was inspired by God. We don't have that system of government anymore, but we're going to talk about it today because if we don't bring it back, we are in serious trouble. We have now another constitution that has been changed over time, and it is not what the original was. So I'm not going to talk to you very much today about that second one. I am going to talk to you about some of the things that have happened with the federal government. But I want you to know that my love and my passion is the original Constitution. So today, let's begin by, I'm going to talk to you about the role of government in education. And I will give you a quote from Oak on that will explain that to you a little better, but we'll go into the presentation a little bit first. What? That. Oh, I've held it the wrong way. I told you this is a first, folks. Okay, okay. America's political system is based on protecting your inalienable rights. That's what the Constitution of the United States is all about. It's a document to protect your rights. Those rights were given to you by God, not by man, not by government. What is a government? A government is power. You have to have power vested in the government because if you don't, it can't insist that you do the things that you're supposed to do. So you create a system of government and then you give it the power to make sure that you follow the principles of law that it establishes. That power also gives a real opportunity for other people to misuse it and to take those powers, that freedom away from you. So governments have power, and they must be carefully structured, and then they must be supervised. This statement by George Washington is one of my absolute favorites. Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Like fire, it is extremely beneficial, but it must be handled with caution. We live in a constitutional republic. That is, a republic means that we have representatives who that we select our representatives and they create our government for us. They officiate in government for us. And their rights and responsibilities and their duties are outlined in a constitution. This system of government is so successful that in 1905, just 116 years after the Constitution was written, and we had lived under that system for 116 years, we created 50% of the world's goods with only 5% of the world's land mass and 6% of our population. Is that success or what? That is success. How can you measure it any better than that? I give you a look at one of our big and beautiful cities. This is an older version of that. That's New York City, but that's the prosperity that was created by our Constitution. So our citizens have the greatest freedom when they control the power of government, when they keep government limited and close. I'm going to give you just a couple of key concepts today. This is one of the main ones. Government has to be kept limited, and it has to be kept close to the people. Those are the people that we're concerned about. That's a family reunion. Don't they look happy? I love all those colored shirts. But those are the people of America for whom government must be kept limited and close. So let's talk about keeping government limited. Power is limited when it is divided horizontally. Now, let's talk about why we divide power. If I give you all the power in the world, do you think that you are going to continue to use it appropriately and righteously, morally? Do you think you would? You wouldn't. Because when an individual is given absolute power, that individual eventually begins to misuse the power. And that is very true of governments. So when we dish out this government power, this force that government is constructed of, we divide it in parcels so that everybody gets, not everybody, but so that different entities get parts of it and nobody can misuse it. And this explains how we divided that power. Congress makes the law. The executive makes certain that the laws are enforced, and the Supreme Court makes sure that the laws are appropriate. That was the division of power. If we do those things, the power is limited and everything stays just the way it should, and our individual rights are protected. There's that body of Congress. Isn't that a marvelous looking building? This is the system that has evolved through our division of power to create the House of Representatives and the Congress. So the people also have power when government is kept as close to you as possible. And so power has been divided vertically like this. Horizontally was what we just talked about, keeping it limited. Now when we want to keep it close, we divide power this way. Power needs to rest as close as possible to the people. So the basic unit of government is the family. The families are organized into a community. The communities into cities, into counties, into states, and then finally into the federal government. These are the people in our local communities that are helping to set our laws. You want those decisions that control you or that dictate to you kept as close to you as they can be kept. The further away from you they move, the less freedom you have. That's a basic principle. The closer the decisions are to you, the more freedom you have. The further the decisions are from you, the less freedom you have. And so when the Founding Fathers established our system of government, they established it such that decisions would be kept close to the people and the power would be kept close to them. So there are power centers in our government. Under the original Constitution, the states and the people were the ones who were supposed to have the power. Only 26 responsibilities were assigned to the federal government. Just a little note, do you know how many the federal government has now? Anybody want to guess? Put 2 zeros after the 26, and that's the number of departments. So you see what has happened. One of the reasons our Constitution is in trouble and our country's in trouble is because we've allowed government to move far away from us and to become very big. The United States had 13 states at the very beginning. Each one of those states, and today this is true, each of those states was to become an individual entity, a laboratory. Okay, so we need to know how to handle this particular problem. What do we do about education and such things as that? Okay, well, let's let our states, each state becomes its individual laboratory to figure out, okay, how do we appropriately handle education within our state boundaries? And then once those decisions are made and the state and individual states, let's say Virginia, back there in the early days when they had 13 states, Virginia found a really good way to educate the people and really produce good educational benefits and educational programs, namely keeping them as close to the people as possible. And then the other states begin to get those ideas, and so the other states begin to imitate it. That's how the Founding Fathers set that up. Changes to our Constitution have destroyed its delicate protective balance and allowed the federal government to assume vast and unintended powers. The system of justice, the justice of our government, has been upset. You see, she's got blindfold on. That's where we like this picture. Justice has become blindfolded. So changes have removed the limited and the close, and in the process they have removed free. These are the things that have happened in our government to change our system of government. We have had many destructive amendments that have been passed. We have had unlawful legislation by the Supreme Court. We just saw that in the rulings on gay marriage. The Supreme Court has begun to legislate. It's gotten itself confused. They think they're elected by the people, and they've joined Congress, and they are beginning to legislate with their judgments. Not appropriate at all for the Supreme Court. Executive overreach. We are now governing a great deal with the President of the United States writing executive orders. That is inappropriate. That's unconstitutional. We have replaced Christianity with secular humanism as our national religion. I wish we had more time to go into that. Let me just give you one or two statements on that. Secular humanism is that other great Western religion. It's the religion where man worships himself rather than Christianity, which is the worship of God. And so long as that philosophy and that religion prevails in our country, our freedoms are in serious jeopardy, because man worshiping himself doesn't go to good places, and it doesn't make for good government. We also have a focus on world government rather than national sovereignty. Our objective has been to make America a great place, but more and more our political leaders are focusing on the world government. That is, remember what we said about keeping the power close to the people? So we've had lots of experience over the last 100 years or so of moving power far from the people up to the federal government. Guess how far away the power is going to be from the people if we move to world government instead of a national government. And yet there is a real move afoot to do that. This is the United Nations building, and a lot of these moves to create world government are coming from there. Those who work to end freedoms must control three things. They must control the media, which are the messages heard by the people. They must control the economy, which is the prosperity of the people. And they must control education, which are the minds and hearts of the young. I'm going to touch just briefly on the media and on the economy, and then I'm going to focus on education, because I want you to see what's happened in the field of education. On the media, remember what I just told you about world government. This is a statement made by David Rockefeller on June of 1991 in the Bilderberger meeting in Baden, Germany. He said, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to publicity. The world is now prepared to march toward a world government. The worldwide sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national self-government practiced in past centuries." Would you like an interpretation of that? I thought so. This is what he said. "Thank you to the media of the United States for keeping our secret. We've been working to build world government, and we're just about there. And it is surely better for world leaders, the rich and the elite, to make the decisions concerning government than it is for the ordinary people to do so." Our Constitution of the United States gave power to the ordinary people, to you and I, to decide what is best for us. But we have been moving away from that at a steady pace for at least the last 100 years. Now so there are some of your media. The economy. Control of our national finances was taken from the people and given to private bankers called the Federal Reserve, who control the economy for their profit. The economy of the United States is no longer controlled for your profit. It's now controlled for the profit of the bankers whose money we use. Debt is to their benefit. National debt now stands at $17 trillion, with combined future federal responsibilities at between $87 to $126 trillion. You have heard on the news, I'm sure all of you are aware, that there are problems with the economy. Just in the last few weeks alone, we have shot past the 17 trillion figure. Debt is mounting in the United States at a rate that is absolutely unsustainable. And the total debt that we have, the commitments that we have made, include more money than exists in the world. The world doesn't contain $126 trillion. So when we talk about the fact that you have to control the economy in order to defeat the Constitution and implement your own principles of government, we are rapidly on our way to doing that. This is the New York Stock Exchange, where a lot of the financial decisions in the United States are made. Now let's talk about education, because that's why we're here today, and that's my love. When Oak was giving you my bio, he said that I am a former disaffected school teacher. I taught school so many years ago when our oldest child was a baby, and then I left teaching and stayed at home to raise my children. But when our youngest child was in high school, I went back to substitute teaching. And we were living in Layton, Utah at the time, and they had this automated system for offering you a substitute teaching position. Well, I was distracted one day when I answered that, and I thought they said October 16th to October 17th for this substitute teaching assignment, and so I accepted it. And after I accepted it, I found out it was from October 16th to November 17th. And I had just signed up for a 5-week substituting class in a 4th grade classroom. I'm glad that experience happened to me because I got a real eyeful. That was 10 years ago. I couldn't believe how difficult it was to teach in a classroom and how much government interference had come into the educational system at that time. And they didn't even have Common Core and so many of the things that are threatening the school system today. So I know that the educational system in the public schools has some real challenges. There are good teachers, there are good people teaching, but the system itself is moving more and more toward bureaucracy and control. So, what is the role of government in education? This is what Oak told me when he sent me the email. He said, I would like you to address education and its place in the federal government. None. I have chuckled about that for the last, it's been 7 weeks since he gave me the assignment, because he has just given you the most succinct description of what the responsibilities of the federal government are where education is concerned that could possibly be given. Who could give it more succinctly than one 4-letter word? None. So let's talk about what the history of education is in the federal government and education. The education process, this is under the Founding Fathers as they created the Constitution. Now, let me explain something. In the Constitution, it does not say, moms and dads, teach your children. It does not say the states are supposed to be the ultimate power authority that should ever get involved in education, but education should be done by the parents and the community. It doesn't say that. It never hardly even mentions education. What it does say is that it mentions the duties of government, and then it says anything else falls, this is the 10th Amendment, anything else falls under the people and the states. So it's not that they say who is in charge of education, they tell you who isn't in charge of education, and it isn't the federal government. Don't we sometimes wish we could go back to the Little Red Schoolhouse? Benjamin Franklin gave us his okay, so I have to explain that just a little bit. The Founding Fathers intended that religion be part of our education. And Benjamin Franklin explained what religion was, because a lot of people don't understand that. You hear about separation of church and state. Okay, that was never part of the Constitution. What the Constitution says is that the federal government is not supposed to interfere with religion. We've twisted that today to say that religion is not supposed to interfere with the federal government. We've gotten it backwards. It was intended that religion be taught in the schools, but you needed to understand what religion meant. It was that creed and Benjamin Franklin best described it. This is what he said. Here is my creed, his religious creed, and this was what was to be taught. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we can render to him is in doing good to his other children. There are 5 basic religious principles there. They are the basic religious principles of every major religion. And those 5 principles should be taught in school. And here is a statement from the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 that outlines, okay, so the Northwest Ordinance, let me go on to the next. There you see the Northwest Ordinance. You see that gold, that gold thing with that gold portion of the United States there. The United States purchased that in right around 1787. And so as the Constitutional Convention was meeting to write the Constitution, the Congress of the United States, under a previous handicapped system of government, was deciding what to do with the Northwest Territory. And they ultimately decided to divide it into 5 states. But in the process of designating this whole thing, they made some statements about what the role of education and what the role of religion was in education. And this is their statement. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. It is part of our system that we teach religion, that we teach the religious principles upon which morality is based. Folks, you can't have freedom if you aren't moral. Because if you aren't moral, you don't understand what right and wrong are. And if you don't understand what right and wrong are, and somebody lets you govern yourself, you're going to walk on lots of people's toes and create lots of problems. So those two have to go hand in hand. James Wilson, founding father James Wilson, called them twin sisters. Others have called them twin pillars of freedom, but they must be related to each other. And therefore, we need to be teaching that in the schools. It's part of what we educate our children to. Guess what? There's a right and there's a wrong, and you are expected to follow it. And then we teach them what it is. So let's go through the history of education, and I want you to really understand this statement. History is to a nation what memory is to an individual. This is why it is so important that our children understand our history. That's why it's so important for them to understand the Constitution. It's the memory of the nation. If you take a memory away from a child, the child can't function. You take the history away from a nation, and the nation can't function. We must understand our history.
Pamela?
Yes?
Is that a quote from you?
What?
Is that your quote, or is that a quote?
You know, I went to a conference a couple of months ago, and one of the speakers made that statement. And I was sitting there and I went, whoa, that's the best statement I've ever heard. So no, it's not mine. Oops, I gotta quit doing that. It's not mine, but I don't know who said it. So if you want to claim that I said it, gee, that would be really great, but you're on your own. Okay, so the first schools in the United States were taught in Jamestown, and they used the Bible as their course of study. A visitor to the United States in 1765 said, "Those who cannot read are rare as an earthquake." How successful was that system of government, of education? Very. Later, schools with locally elected officials were built in rural communities, and they used the McGuffey Readers. Have any of you ever seen the McGuffey Readers? They're great, aren't they? When I saw them the first time, I was a sophisticated teacher in training at BYU, and I thought, oh, what are they talking about? All religion and education? Oh gosh, I really didn't understand it. It took me a while to get it. But they used religious stories and religious principles to teach what? Reading, everything. They taught through religious principles. So there's your McGuffey Reader. Then deism and Unitarianism began to enter in. Deism is the belief that God is a distant and uninvolved creator. That began with a man named Horace Mann, And shortly afterwards, Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard, introduced evolution, which is the alternate view of creation. And within 4 years, evolution was being taught to teachers in teacher training colleges. Humanism, which is, as we mentioned earlier, the belief that the religious philosophy where man worships himself, began to enter the United States in about the late 1800s. When the states took control of education, about 20 years later, the federal government stepped into education, and humanism, the belief of man as God, began to take over the system because we have to separate church and state. That's how that happened. This is the motto and the emblem for the American Humanist Association, the Organization of Secular Humanists. Good without a God. This is the philosophy that now guides the government. Because we have to leave religion out of the government, nature abhors a vacuum, remember? So if you leave that teaching out of government, something else rushes in to fill it. And the thing that has rushed in to fill it is the belief there's got to be some great authority there, right? So if we're not going to believe that God is the great authority, we're going to put man in his place. And that's what we're working with right now. That's what's entering into so many of our materials in the schools. So humanism today is a core principle, and under humanism, right and wrong are variable. Depends on what you want to do. Depends on what you like to do. Depends on whether you're stranded on a desert island. Depends on who it was who your parents were, where you came from. No, right and wrong are right and wrong. They're universal for all mankind, but we are losing that rapidly. And the child is now an evolving being that requires direction, not a being created in the image of God. That really gets the point across, doesn't it? This is what youth has become, or is becoming, or too many of them have become. But that was not the intention. Had we been able to maintain the right to educate our children as we chose to educate them, we wouldn't be where we are today. And when I was a mom, taking my children through the elementary school system, you couldn't homeschool. I would have liked to have homeschooled, but you couldn't. They wouldn't let you do that. And there weren't any alternative forms of education out there. You are so fortunate for the things that you've been talking about here in this meeting today, because you have options. We had an option. We could send the kids to the local public school, or we could send them to the local public school, or we could send them to the local public school. You could get arrested if you didn't. Education is now controlled by a humanist federal government through the misuse of federal power. John Stormer wrote the book None Dare Call It Education, and this is a quote from him. Theoretically, a society could be completely made over in something like 15 years, the time it takes to inculcate a new culture into a rising crop of youngsters. Again, the importance of education. Thomas Sowell, famous columnist, if every parent in America knew what was really going on in the public schools, there would be a revolution. Because there are a lot of things happening in education that parents are not aware of. And here in Utah, we sit in a little bit of a cocoon. We lived in the Washington, D.C. area for 10 years, and then we lived in Nebraska for another 7. And there's a slower pace to what's happening here in Utah, but we still have to be very careful. So our founding fathers, this is George Washington in his first State of the Union address. He said, "Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness. Every valuable end of government is best answered by teaching the people to value their own rights and uniting a speedy vigilance against encroachment." In other words, the best way to take care of your youth is to teach them. I thought you'd like a translation on that one also. If you want to see the difference in what we are creating, take a look at a child coming out of the public school system today and compare his or her ability to read and write and communicate with the Founding Fathers. I read the Founding Fathers a lot. I have a dictionary that thick that sits right at my feet when I write, when I'm reading, because you give me 3 pages to write and I'll probably have to look up 3 words. I mean, it's just their language, their ability to communicate was so phenomenal. So what is the solution? What can we do to turn our country back to the appropriate use of government power? We could turn up with a lot of answers to that if I opened that up to discussion. But what I really want to do is give you one powerful solution. And I hope that you find other powerful solutions on your own. Isaiah said this. If you have not found this scripture yet, for any of you involved in education or in teaching your own children, your own family, you need to know this scripture. Isaiah 5:13. Therefore my people are gone into captivity because they have no knowledge. Look at the parallel that Isaiah draws. Captivity and ignorance become one and the same. Here is my powerful solution, and you're probably not very surprised. In view of the fact that I love the Constitution and that I study it and that I've read a stack of books as tall as I am about the Constitution, you're probably not surprised that I think that's one of the solutions. But here's a really great idea, folks. I'm not the only one that thinks that. Because the Constitution is the foundation for what happens in our country. If you don't have a foundation, what happens to your house? It falls. Our freedoms are based on this document. It is therefore imperative that we teach the Constitution. Let me tell you how I ended up becoming so infatuated isn't the right word, so in love with the Constitution. My husband and I served a mission for the LDS Church to Italy. We've been home 4.5 years. We saw socialism up close when we were in Italy. And it was just this amazing experience to see that the people dressed, the women in Italy were black all the time. And I couldn't figure out why did they never, I knew many of them and I never saw any of them in anything but black. And I began to ask myself, why? And then it dawned on me, well, guess what? When you live under socialism, you don't have any hope. And your apparel begins to reflect that. It was just, I began seeing what socialism does to people when they don't have free government, when they aren't able to control their circumstances, when the government tells them everything what to do. I mean, it just, the people become, it's like a balloon with air let out of it. I'll give you a good example of that. We had to pay our rent. We'd been there a month, and we couldn't get a hold of the landlord to get him to come pick up the money, and we're saying, come pick up your money. And we called him, and we called him, and we called him, never came. And pretty soon it was almost to the second month, and we're sitting there still holding the rent for the first month. And so we start getting really antsy about it. Mateo, where are you? Come and let us pay you the rent. He never came. We finally found his address and tracked him down, went to his house, and gave him the rent. And afterwards, we were talking to some of the elders that just lived 2 blocks from us and that we learned to love like they were our own kids. And we said, what is the deal? I forgot to tell you, that happened again. A couple of months later, we couldn't get this landlord to come pick up the rent. And so we said to the missionaries, what is going on? And they said, oh, you don't understand socialism. He doesn't get to keep the rent. He has to give it to the government, and the government gives him back a stipend, and he gets the stipend whether he collects your rent or not. And I said, are you serious? And they said, yeah. They said, in fact, if you wanted to, you could just not pay your rent the whole time you're here, because it takes 1.5 years for them to start proceedings to boot you out of your apartment, and by then you'll be home because you're on an 18-month mission. And Bob and I are looking at each other going, because we were paying $750 for 400 square feet. And they bricked over the windows. They do very interesting things with architecture in Italy. So you have these windows, and they build a brick wall about 18 inches out from the window, but they left out about every 10th brick. And so not only was it a very small apartment, but it was kind of a depressing apartment, and it was furnished, and the only piece of furniture that you could sit on, other than the kitchen chairs, was the most uncomfortable and most abominable orange love seat that you have ever seen in your life. And so I would have been happy to go without paying the rent. But it didn't matter whether we paid the rent. Well, that's what socialism is. That's what happens when the government becomes so involved and so controlling in your life. We don't, any of us, want to be there in the United States. We want freedom. We want to know what the principles are upon which this amazing nation of ours was founded. Well, the principles upon which they were founded are these, that we get to govern ourselves under correct principles and working by the principles of morality, of right and wrong. And so we have got to teach this to our children. We have got to study the Constitution ourselves, and we have got to teach it to our children. In addition to that, we need to teach the Founding Fathers. They are some of the most amazing men. I so love George Washington. I have read many books on him. He is the most wonderful, was the most wonderful man. And so was Samuel Adams. He's my other favorite. He's the one who kicked off the American Revolution in 1764, in Faneuil Hall in Boston. I could go on. The Founding Fathers were amazing men. If we give our children an understanding of those men and the document they created, we give them memory. We give them a reason to know why government is so important, why freedom is important, why we want to defend it, why we want to stand up for it. So we teach the Constitution, and we teach the Founding Fathers. And that's what got me involved in writing books. You know, the more I read, the more I studied, my soul became so filled with a love of this document and the men who wrote it, and a need to go back to the prosperity that we once had. I couldn't contain it. So it just spilled out onto the pages. And then, so as I wrote the book, I wrote it in short vignettes, a page and a half each. So I took a principle on the Constitution, and I described the entire thing in a page and a half. I had a lot of fun with that. It was a lot of work, combing through to find unnecessary words so I could keep it at 550 words and keep it to a page and a half. But I managed to explain every one of 129 constitutional principles, plus some history and some on the founders and what's been done to destroy it and what we need to go back to go back to those original freedoms. I managed to do each one of those 129 topics in a page and a half. And then as we sent the book to the printers, the assistant editor that I was working with, who had been a curriculum specialist in the elementary schools, said, "Do you realize how easy it would be to take each one of those page and a half vignettes and turn them into a course of study for youth on the Constitution?" And so we did. We took each one of those vignettes, formulated 3 questions to teach the principles and the application of the Constitution and the moral principles that stood behind that particular part of the Constitution. We put them into a workbook for young people, and then we created a parent-teacher volume with the answers and additional resources for that. It was a wonderful experience. Guess what, folks? I now understand the Constitution. It was great. I loved writing it. I hope that you will love reading it if that's of interest to you. So you teach the Constitution and you teach the Founding Fathers. Now, there is hope. And the hope happens right there with parents who teach their children. That is the hope of America. It can be done. I want you to know that I love the Constitution. You haven't figured that out, have you? It's been a pleasure to talk to you. There is so much power in this room because you have the power to change our country in the future. You have the power to teach your children and the others that are in the classrooms with you, to teach them freedom and to take them back to the prosperity that America once knew, when we created 50% of the world's goods with only 5% of the world's landmass and 6% of the world's population. It can be done. We can have that back again. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. I'm about a minute over, so.
Very good.